everyone, and welcome to the Advancing Cyber Podcast Origin Story Series. Today's guest is Katie Moussouris, founder and CEO of Luta Security. She's so awesome. We got so into our conversation about vulns and policy and spyware and life that we decided to share this as 2 episodes. So enjoy part 1 of Advancing Cyber Origin Stories with Katie Moussouris. Welcome to the Advancing Cyber Podcast Origin Story Series. Many of us began working in cybersecurity in the late 90s or early 2000s, before Homeland Security and much of what we know as cybersecurity today. I wanted to capture the origin stories from those who were there, living it, and helping build the technology, laws, and policies that we all know and live with. And I know of no better place and no better person to help tell some of these stories than Katie Moussouris. She's the founder and CEO of Luta Security, a company that creates and manages sustainable bug bounties and vulnerability disclosure programs. Katie is the co-author and co-editor of 2 ISO standards, 29147 Vuln Disclosure and ISO 30111 Vulnerability Handling Processes. During her tenure with Microsoft, Katie started the Microsoft Vulnerability Research Program, as well as Microsoft's first bug bounty program. She served as technical advisor to the U.S. Export Control Wassenaar delegation to help renegotiate regulations of software classified as intrusion software and technology. Ms. Moussouris led the launch of the U.S. government's first bug bounty program, Hack the Pentagon. She served as an inaugural member of the Department of Homeland Security's Cyber Safety Review Board and continues to serve on the U.S. Department of Commerce's Information Systems Technical Advisory Committee and NIST's Information Security and Privacy Advisory Board. So for those of you playing at home who speak acronym, that's ISO IEC, MSVR, CSRB, DHS, DOC, ISTAC, and ISPAP. Did I get all those, Katie?
You certainly did. And I am really grateful that you included all of those. That's my alphabet soup of advisory committees and roles.
Awesome. Well, I know you've got an amazing background and you were already a well-known leader in cyber and in the hacker community when you and I first met in July of 2008. And at that point, you had been at Microsoft for about a year and you were getting ready to launch the Microsoft Vulnerability Research Program. And I had just moved out from DC to Redmond to become your lawyer. And so that's our backstory. So I would love it if you could sort of set the stage for what the world was like back then, because I don't know that for people who didn't live through it, it was a really crazy time in vulnerabilities, right? We didn't have the cloud. We didn't have this concept of vulnerability disclosure. And we had these 2 competing philosophies of full disclosure or responsible disclosure. And it was like a religious war. So can you set the stage a little bit for what that was like? Because I don't think people remember, or we've all chosen to forget the trauma of that time.
Oh my goodness, yes. So it was the best of times and the worst of times, but it was an opportunity laden time. You know, Microsoft was one of the first major vendors to even try to coordinate disclosure with researchers. And that was basically because it had been, had a lot of vulnerabilities disclosed publicly without that kind of coordination step beforehand. So Microsoft was actually a leader by the time I even got there. They were already a leader in working cooperatively with security researchers. But nobody in the industry, besides some hackers, had actually formalized their own vuln disclosure policies. And you and I worked on that a couple of years after we met in formalizing what Microsoft was already doing in terms of coordinating vuln disclosure. But back in 2008, I would say, even hackers had not been doing formal vulnerability disclosure with policies in place of their own, not even a decade at that point. Rainforest Puppy, the hacker who wrote RF Policy, which a lot of vuln disclosure programs are based on, their policies are based on, that was actually a policy written by a hacker to sort of let vendors know how he was going to act with them and how much time he would give them before he publicly disclosed. And this was actually a very useful thing for him to document. And this was back in 1999. And then probably around 2000, 2001 or so, the term responsible disclosure became part of the vocabulary. And that was, trying to get researchers to give vendors more time to work on those fixes because, it's not one size fits all. Some issues required more investigation. Some issues required additional work to fix comprehensively and not just do a Band-Aid fix that would quickly unravel. So there was a lot of back and forth, and there was a differing philosophy. You touched on it in terms of full disclosure versus, at the time it was called responsible disclosure. Later, we renamed it Coordinated Vuln Disclosure because that's more descriptive. But the two factions were really talking about, can we reduce risk of users by telling them all at the same time what they are at risk of and letting them all sort it out? Or do we give, the vendors a chance to fix it, but while possibly allowing attackers to take advantage of that time delay in public disclosure? So that was kind of the two warring philosophies. And, they both kind of had their merits. There is a limit of how long, you really want to keep something quiet and in the hopes that no bad actors will find it and start exploiting it, right? But there's never been, a great agreement point on exactly what that limit is. And what I mentioned earlier, too, is that there is no one size fits all. And so the act of coordinating is really working through that process as closely as you can between the reporter of the vulnerability and the vendor who has to fix it and test those fixes. And ideally, you come out with, something where everybody is satisfied that the best foot forward was, everyone put their best foot forward in good faith effort, and you got something out that was stable and wouldn't cause more problems than they would solve by having good, stable patches, good, stable updates, and not take too much time. So that was kind of the world back then.
But I also remember the added dynamic that researchers were still making their name and their way with security conferences. And so there was pressure to also be ready to release their proof of concept and get on stage and talk about their vulnerabilities, particularly at Black Hat. I remember July was always a super busy month. And so I remember just coming into the MSRC world in July of 2008, thinking, what have I done? But also learning about the reality that there was a bit of a race back then where finders were pushing so hard to get on stage and do the full disclosure because that was how they were able to show their skills. What was your views back then? That was, at least from this lawyer's view, was like, oh my goodness, that's such a big deal. That was also part of my take on the culture. Is that fair?
Well, I think, hackers played a part in that. The conferences themselves played a part in that. And the media and what they would cover and what they would not cover also played a big part in that. I will give you an example. This was from a few years later when the first car hacking examples were coming into vogue. And I will tell you a tale of two car hacks. There was one car hack that was a 0-day. It was unpatched at the time of disclosure. I mean, they had given the researchers had given the vendor some time to patch it, but it wasn't fully patched. And even though some of the patching was available, it wasn't applied, right? There was no real good deployment mechanism. So, even with patches available, cars were still vulnerable and consumers were still at risk. But there was another car hack that the researcher did everything that, a vendor would hope that they do. They privately disclosed it. They worked with the vendor to get it fixed. Nobody wanted to cover it from the media. And that hacker went unsung. And that is like the unfortunate reality of, the culture that we had. And it wasn't all just hackers pushing it. It was really the media, reinforcing it. It was the conference organizers who were much more interested in novel exploits, meaning 0 days, than they were in things where, everybody played nicely. Like, where's the tension in the story with that? So unfortunately, we kind of had this perfect storm of the dry tinder of bugs, the spark of the hackers' 0 days, and, the wind of the media just blowing on this thing. And before you knew it, you had big forest fires.
Yeah. Well, I certainly remember living through quite a few of the out of bands in that era too. My all-time favorite the MS speak, MS 08067 configure, which shockingly still lives on today. How that's even possible is beyond me. Some of those out of bands that were, to your point, huge in the media and just completely roiled the industry in 2008, 2009, 2010. I remember those building towards this feeling like we had to do something different. Is that what led to coordinated vulnerability disclosure? Was that part of it? What other dynamics were going on, and what was that?
Well, so Coordinated Vuln Disclosure was more than just a name change. As you know, you were there living it with me as my lawyer at Microsoft. But one thing was we needed to define how we, as finders of vulnerabilities, and we, as coordinators of multi-party supply chain vulnerabilities, would behave in this disclosure process. And so we needed some kind of policy that, one, formalized what we would do as vendors and what to expect from us, in terms of responsiveness and how to get in touch with us and all those good things. But we also had to define our other roles in vuln disclosure. And that was where Coordinated Vuln Disclosure came from. It was actually, part of it was, you mentioned Microsoft Vulnerability Research. For those listening that are familiar with Google Project Zero, where they look for vulnerabilities in third-party software, Microsoft Vulnerability Research predated Google Project Zero by several years. And it was Microsoft's looking for third-party bugs. And that was to secure the ecosystem, same kind of reasons. But when Microsoft was looking for bugs and we were the original finders and discoverers, we needed a policy and we needed a way that would make us more predictable as a partner to work with other vendors and work with researchers as well. I think one of the first items that we coordinated through Microsoft Vulnerability Research was, I think we called it a blended threat back then. That term didn't really take off, but that's what we called it. And it was one bug that was fairly low severity for Microsoft, coupled with another fairly low severity bug from Apple, together made a high severity exploit possible, right? And so we had to do this coordination through Microsoft Vulnerability Research. We worked through the defined policy that we had for Coordinated Vuln Disclosure, where we were acting as both finder and coordinator of these issues. And we worked to get a coordinated fix out between two major vendors. And that was quite a feat. Honestly, in my experience, it's still quite a feat. A lot of organizations still do not know how to do multi-party vulnerability coordination very well. And that's the reality we live in. And certainly we saw that played out most recently in some library issues. Log4j, would be one big issue where there was a open source library incorporated into multiple products, multiple vendors having to respond at once, and the coordination did not go as smoothly as one would have liked.
So let's go there. You'd think that it was 2012 when you guys first announced the Coordinated Vulnerability Disclosure concept, and we'll share the links out.
I think it was 2010.
I'm sorry, 2010, yeah. July 2010, yeah. And we'll share the links out for the blogs. It was July 2010, and I love the title that you had for your blog because it was called Bringing Balance to the Force, which I thought was great. And so we'll share that out. But why is it that, we're now 15 years later, Log4j was a couple of years ago, but why is it that this is still so hard to do? What is it that's in either the finder ecosystem or the company side that is still making coordinating vulns and patching them such a emotionally fraught space?
I think you nailed it right there. It's emotionally fraught because it is learned and relearned anew almost every single time because of the lack of formalization of process. So we mentioned at the beginning, the ISO standards that I'm co-author and co-editor for. One is on vuln disclosure and one is on vulnerability handling processes. And that's like, if you think of vuln disclosure as the intake mechanism and the output mechanism, you intake a possible bug to investigate, and then you output a fix and some kind of communication about that fix. That's what's in ISO 29147 vulnerability disclosure. But what's in ISO 30111 is the digestive system of those bugs. It's the processes that you do to investigate, to coordinate, to, rope in other parties if you need to. And that's the part that hardly anybody has right, and they don't formalize it. So what they do is they reinvent the wheel every time. it's a crisis almost every time. It's emotional. And then by the time, that organization has to do it again, a lot of the key players are gone. Their contacts at other vendors may have moved on. And I think we've seen in the last few years where layoffs and job cuts have affected even the cybersecurity job roles that we all thought were safe for a long time. We've seen teams get churned, and you just lose that institutional knowledge without the process documentation. And I mean, I am a hacker, literally wearing a hacker's t-shirt right now, telling you about ISO standards and process documentation because it's true. It's honestly, that's the thing that's going to save us all. It's the thing that'll save the hackers, the vendors, the users, and that's the thing that nobody wants to do. It is the dental hygiene of security.
And, shout out to my brothers and sisters on the legal side. Like, do not be afraid. Standards are our friends, right? They are the tools of liability mitigation and risk mitigation. And I agree. I think that those two standards are way underutilized in contracts, in business processes, in controls for internal corporate use. And I do think that there's so much more emotional energy in here than there needs to be. And I still find it surprising. So you deal with this space all the time. Like this is part of what your company does. So talk about Luta Security and some of the ways in which you coach people through the, stages of grieving, stages of awareness. Like how do you coach people in this space when they need to come to grips with vulnerability, either disclosure or moving into this space?
No, I mean, honestly, I have phrased it as the 5 stages of vulnerability response grief. It is very apt because, the first thing that happens is people get, first they're in denial saying there's no bug here, right? Or they don't understand the bug, and then they get angry and they go threatening. And for your legal listeners, that is one area where our company helps advise, right? We help advise across all process areas, but one of them is legal. And when we encounter a legal team that is really smart, like we find people who are looking to protect their company, their users, their brand. And when we explain that trying to lock down and tighten control, tighten the scope of these programs or enforce non-disclosure agreements when there's no bounty involved, especially, in all of these things, that they're actually introducing a greater risk that, one, hackers won't come to them at all. If the terms seem too scary, they're just not going to come forward. You mentioned the Department of Defense first bug bounty program. One of the key changes that I got the DoD to do was they had all their scary legalese at the top. I said, you know what, you can have it, but just put it at the bottom. Put the nice things up top where, you want to work with researchers. Here's the scope. Here's some technical bits about what you should and shouldn't do when you're testing, and then put the legalese at the end. And I mean, even just things like that make a huge difference in how well your program does and how well it's received and how much you're trusted. Because really, the point of establishing these programs is to not just establish a way to get in contact, but it's a way to establish trust. And the more trust you can build over time, among all these parties, the better your outcomes are going to be.
So I get the argument made to me that having a vuln disclosure policy just invites trouble. And I'm sure you do too. So how do you get people over that hump that even having a vuln disclosure policy is not opening the door to a parade of horribles?
Well, I mean, I think everybody has this idea that, if they just bury their heads in the sand and don't advertise that, that they're open to being notified about these things, that people won't hack them, that they're rolling out a red carpet for attacks, right? And they misunderstand that, no, the attacks are definitely happening. You're just not making it easy for good Samaritans to tell you about it, to give you, some kind of advance notice. And most criminals do not report vulnerabilities. This is not like a Bond villain who's going to tell you all the ways in which he's about to blow up the world, and everything, and just sends it to you in a nice report. So once we kind of get over that, initial reluctance, that reticence to offer a way to get in touch, things tend to go a lot better. There is still often, just getting their operational sea legs under them. So they say, okay, we've opened the front door. We've made it easy to find us. Now what? Now they start receiving all these bug reports, and there's, junk ones that aren't real. There are spam messages. There are what we call beg bounty, where even if you're not offering a cash reward, they're asking for money, and everything. And there's a difference between those who are just saying, do you have a bug bounty program? Which is perfectly fine to ask, right? Could I get paid for this work with you? And I won't tell you anything unless you pay me, which is extortion, right? And so sometimes we coach our customers on knowing the difference, because even if they're not ready to offer cash rewards, which is perfectly fine to not do that for as long as you want, it is still something where they're going to need to sort of understand where security researcher is coming from if they're asking, do you have a paid program? And, there are other ways to engage with researchers other than bug bounty programs. If they come to you and they ask you, do you have a paid program, and you don't, you might consider hiring them for a short-term, penetration test if they're good at finding bugs in your products. So there are other ways to do things and other ways to engage with that community.
Sure. Or you may just pay them outright. I recently had a situation with a client where we did just that. And, everybody goes away happy. So I think that's what I really like. And I think the takeaway is that bugs don't have feelings and bounties don't have feelings. People do. And the more we can leverage the standards that you helped lead and that have been around, when were both of those standards first introduced? I know they've been updated, but when were they first done?
2013. So it was late 2013 and early 2014. They kind of, staggered a little bit coming out, but they have been out for, well over a decade at this point. They have both been revised. I think 2018 was when their last revision was. But, the principles are the same. And what is interesting, when you said they're not used nearly enough, the Vuln Disclosure one is referred to around the world. The vulnerability handling processes, like how you actually do this properly, is hardly ever mentioned. And that, I think, is something that people should really understand. They have been misinformed that, quote unquote, the first step is get a policy out there and have some way to reach you. That has been completely misrepresented as this is the first step to setting these programs up. No, of course not. Would you open a restaurant and, put an online store with a menu where people could order food when you don't have a kitchen and you haven't hired any chefs and you don't have, no, of course not, right? So they are setting things up and setting up a front door that's ultimately, if they haven't figured out how to staff it internally and what processes they're going to follow, those bugs are going to go into a black hole and break trust, like we were saying. And they won't have very many options except to try and, pay researchers off for silence and, and whatnot. But it's not a winning strategy, ultimately. It doesn't reduce risk.
Totally. I completely agree. But if there is a lawyer out there who's using 29-147 and 30-111 in their contracts, please reach out and let me know, because you're going to be my new hero. And I would love to hear about how you're doing that, because it is, I agree, 29-147 is being used in companies and helping set up these programs. And I'd love to see more use of 30-111. And I really want to see more attorneys putting these into contracts as requirements to help get the implementation moving out. I want to sort of broaden the aperture, because we have a really great example from a few years ago when coordinated vulnerability disclosure really, really worked in the industry and government didn't like it. And that was the Spectre meltdown vulnerabilities. Can you explain for folks who are not super technical, because those are some of the most technical vulnerabilities we've seen in a while. Can you explain what Spectre meltdown was so we can unpack a little bit why it was such a big deal?
Honestly, I was not planning on explaining what those vulnerabilities were. But I mean, look, I will tell you from what you just said, the fact of the matter was there was a successful coordination around those vulnerabilities. And that is one of the things that we don't see a lot of. We don't see a lot of the actual successful coordination of vulnerabilities. And what intrigued me about your setup of this part of the conversation is the fact that you said that government didn't like it. So I want I want you
Yeah.
to expand on that piece a little bit more.
Well, I think it's fascinating, right? Because you had the private sector working for months on this report and trying to fix the vulnerabilities. And so when it finally was released, the governments didn't know. And that's fascinating because it comes at an interesting cost, right? Because that was prior to China's mandatory vulnerability disclosures, right? So that was, I think it was 2019, 2020, and somebody can check me on exactly when that was. But in 2021, China released its mandatory vulnerability disclosure requirement. In Europe, we're going to have the CRA coming into force, which will require disclosure once a single device is compromised. So we'll have mandatory reporting coming up later this year. And so I think it's a fascinating thing. Now that we had this really successful mitigation of a major threat by private sector companies working together in tandem, like they did the right thing, there was this reaction like, wow, we were left vulnerable by governments. So now you're seeing a backlash by a number of countries. So, governments are customers, they're users and defenders and exploiters. Like all of these things are true. So, whether CVD, should governments get a pass or should private sector companies keep holding the line? What do we do with that?
Yeah, the interesting points that you're bringing up here of China's mandatory disclosure to the government, right, of vulnerabilities that affect products in China and products that are part of Chinese infrastructure, that actually came up in Log4j. The discoverers initially did the right thing when it comes to coordinated vuln disclosure. They notified the package maintainers, but they didn't notify the Chinese government within within that time period of requirement. And so the company where the researchers worked was effectively punished by the Chinese government by being kicked out of an information sharing program. I don't know if they're still kicked out or if it was like a temporary 6 months, right? And 6 months timeout. But that was an interesting thing where coordinated vuln disclosure practice and principle were being followed, but it went against that Chinese regulation and there were consequences. Similarly, you were bringing up the Cyber Resilience Act, the CRA in Europe, that's about to go into enforcement with this ridiculously low bar of even one machine compromised. You need to now tell the European Union and let them know. And every single time that I or you or anyone else tried to get the EU to back off of that was going to be a bad idea and would very much broaden the risk against their best efforts, they would say, well, no, you don't need to give us any technical information. You just need to give us high-level warning so that we can, be prepared. And what they don't understand is that even high-level warning is enough for, if someone got a hold of that high-level warning database of wherever they're going to be keeping this information, if an attacker got hold of that, even high level is enough. It's enough of a breadcrumb to have an attacker go and try to find some other security holes. And I will give you an example from the WannaCry issues, right? WannaCry, it was a vulnerability in SMB v1. The patch was available for about 6 months before the WannaCry worm was created. And what happened was once attackers knew that there was something going on with SMB1, they were all able to find not just the vulnerabilities that were in WannaCry, but multiple other ones as well. So you can imagine the CRA going into effect, having companies required to say, oh, there's a vulnerability in, let's say, this software package. Right. Suddenly, all of the attackers could go looking for vulnerabilities in that software package that are obviously being actively exploited. That's the criteria by which, the notification requirement kicks in. And what I would say here is that these approaches introduce additional risk. They are meant to help a country mitigate risk, to know ahead of time, to try and put their defenses in place. But these countries are not necessarily going to, share it with everybody in a proactive, defensive way. Vendors, by definition, when they disclose a vulnerability and its remediation, they're disclosing it to the whole world. They're disclosing it to at least affected users, right? If they are doing a more private disclosure, they're disclosing it to affected users. And so giving, everyone who could potentially become a victim an equal chance to remediate themselves. Whereas these country requirements are by definition going to try and sort of keep these secrets in country or in the European Union, multiple countries, but, within that organizational governance unit. And the fact of the matter is they're not well situated to keep all those secrets, and they're not, well situated to decide who gets, some kind of remediation or mitigation and who doesn't. Especially ahead of a vendor fix. So I've said many, right. I've said many words here, but ultimately what I'm saying is governments interfering in the process flow of coordinated vuln disclosure is going to make us all worse off than we were.
For sure. And there's no doubt in my mind that if a company is required to report that a single device has been popped in Europe, then that country, you'll report it to your national competent authority, to use the term of art from the regulation. Well, that national competent authority will probably be the CERT, the Computer Emergency Response Team, which is staffed by usually vendors and some staffers from that government agency. And so you'll have a mix of vendors and government authorities who then share it with the other now 26 member states, UK, of Europe. And so now you've got 26 computer emergency response teams or agencies and their vendors knowing about the issue. If there's only one single device that's been compromised, what happens? Those national competent authorities call their account reps who typically know nothing, who then start churning inside the company to learn more, to call their people. And now something that was incredibly sensitive, because if a single device is popped in a country that's generally either a researcher testing out a proof of concept or a national security attack starting, now we're off to the races, and we've now got an out-of-band situation on our hands, and it's time to go fast. So I completely agree. I think this is going to be a much bigger problem for us going forward. It makes me kind of nuts.
Absolutely.
So what does this vuln disclosure pressure with governments mean for finders? Because they're in a can't-win situation, because they know governments want to have this information, and they know that they've got some regulatory obligations. How do we help finders navigate this space?
Well, they are the least prepared and least resourced party in all of this. One, they may not want their vulnerability going to all the European countries at once. And unfortunately, if they reported a vulnerability that then is discovered is actually being exploited, even in a small, narrow, one machine with evidence of exploitation, suddenly their discovery is now going to be broadly disclosed to, parties that they wouldn't have necessarily wanted to know about it in the first place. Unfortunately, they don't have a lot of good choices. As individual parties in this equation, they're really at the whim of, whoever they reported it to first. And, I think one other thing, switching a little bit to the other additional risks posed by this is that what if it is one of our many countries, the United States or its European allied countries, are actually exploiters, and we've now outed them, in terms of we discovered this one exploit or this very targeted exploit going on over here. Here's the vulnerability or here's the software, and suddenly, someone's offensive cyber campaign has now been revealed. So I think, the framers of the CRA and the framers of the Chinese regulation, they were probably thinking in terms of this is the best way to defend our critical infrastructure. They weren't taking all these other equities into consideration. And I think that is, that's been a problem for quite some time in vulnerabilities. And when we call the vulnerability equities process, where the, United States and other governments have this VEP, right? This vulnerability equities process to decide what to do with a 0 day when they either find one or acquire one, through purchasing, et cetera. Do they keep it for offensive use, or do they, and possibly risk our own domestic infrastructure being compromised while they're using it on somebody else? Mm-hmm. Or did they report it to the vendor to get it fixed? And the biggest flaw in all vulnerability equities processes that I've ever seen is that governments are not in the best position to ascertain the relative risk, because even vendors might have a hard time knowing where all of their software is deployed, knowing the actual broad footprint of how many vulnerable users or devices are actually out there, especially in the cases of shared libraries. Nobody knew that so many different products and organizations and governments were vulnerable to Log4j until we did. Right? Until we all knew. Nobody knew until we knew. And to your point, hearkening back to an earlier part of the conversation, old vulnerabilities are still being actively exploited. So there's no real way to tell, how broad a footprint of risk there really is in kind of making these calls.
Yeah. There's an old MSRC stat that said 99% of the time when a computer was compromised, the patch was available, but it wasn't installed. And I feel like we're never going to get out of that jail. It may be, lower now, it may be in the 80s, but I still feel like it's a warm temperature regardless. So you brought up the vulnerability equities program. I think that the United States is sort of caught by that, because I can see the pull towards an interest in wanting to know more. When a vulnerability shows up that might have an effect on a national security system. Do you think that there's pressure to require vulnerability disclosure in contracts in that space? Or do you think that we're in enough of an equity space that we still have some time? Can you read any tea leaves there?
So you mean vendors selling to the federal government or any government, right. And the procurement contracts saying if there are vulnerabilities, you should disclose them to us, that's kind of thing?
Yeah.
So I think that we do have some contract inclusions for having vuln disclosure programs, right? Mm-hmm. We are starting to see that get added, which is great as long as, they're including the processes as well, which most of them aren't. But the bit about disclosing vulnerabilities, I think what I've seen has been helpful and not introducing additional harm is adding service level agreements for when you will, as a vendor, fix those vulnerabilities when you become aware of them. Because that essentially takes away the having to disclose them, but it does provide some assurance that, look, once we find out about them, if they're of this severity, we'll fix them within some kind of SLA and, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it serves that purpose of reducing risk without essentially making everyone that you sell to a party to your own vuln disclosure process, which would be unwieldy at best and extremely risky at worst.